Okay, hello everyone. And hello, Dr. Martinelli. It's nice to have you here. There is a series of talks Mimarhane hosts, and I have been in one of them previously, and it's nice to be here again, and it's very nice to have you here actually. So thank you for being with us on this placeless talks. And this placeless situation has made distances come nearer, and we can maybe make some advantage of this pandemic situation. So I think this will be the 11th or 10th talk of placeless talks. I'm not sure about the number, but it's going to be a nice series of talks and discussions about architecture. So we especially wanted to have you here on this series because you have a doctoral thesis focused on Turkish architecture, and especially Beyazıt Square design of Turgut Cansever. So this is a very interesting and important thesis, as we think. So nice to have you here. Welcome again.
Thank you for your invitation.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. We want to actually maybe first introduce ourselves. I'm Celâleddin Çelik'e. I'm a practicing architect. And maybe we can listen to yourself from you. I have some notes, of course, about you and your education and your interests, but we want to hear it from you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm an architect too, first of all. And I obtained my PhD in architectural composition at the University of UAV in Venice in 2017. Mm-hmm. And with the first thesis in Italy about the work of Turgut Cansever, which then I shared in conferences and international publication. And after having worked as an architect in Germany, I have been adjunct professor in à l'École Euro-Méditerranéenne de Fès in Morocco, and then at the Polytechnic of Milan and the University of Pisa. Mm-hmm. And from 2019, I'm research fellow and adjunct professor at the Department of Architecture at the University of Florence. I'm also member of the research unity DARMED, which focuses on the project, architecture and urban project in the Islamic world, mm-hmm. with particular regard to the Turkish situation and the Maghreb. In my cases, I work on that two areas. And I'm also working and developing my own research, design research, in the field of architecture and urban regeneration. So mm-hmm. This is my general interest about architecture.
Mm-hmm. So you had your architectural degree in University of Florence.
Yeah.
And you are still now working for that university.
Yeah.
It's
After
very nice.
some experience around the world, I came back to Florence, and then.
That's nice. Yeah, it's nice. So you practiced architecture in Germany as well.
As well, yeah.
Very nice. Okay. And how was your experience in Morocco? Actually, that's interesting.
Actually, my first source of interest was the North African architecture. So after my degree, my master degree in Florence, I started my own independent research about the Moroccan and North African modern architecture developed by some French architects like Zerfus, Marmel. But at the same time, I knew the Turkish architecture because my thesis supervisor was working on a research in partnership with Boğaziçi University of Istanbul. And a colleague of mine, Serena Chai, was writing a PhD thesis about the figure of Celâleddin. For this reason, I got to know the Turkish modern Turkish architecture.
So that's how you were introduced to Turkish modern architecture.
Yeah.
Mainly. And I don't know if you were introduced to Turkish modern architecture first, then you chose the focused subject of Cansever'in Beyazıt Meydanı, or was it some in some other way? Because your thesis is discussing the relationship between Eldem, Eldem, and Cansever, and the transmissibility of knowledge and this let's say architectural school, as you put it.
Yeah.
So how was this journey? Was it coming from Eldem and his school of architecture, and then was directed to Cansever, or was it that tracking in the reverse direction?
Yeah, it was a process indeed, because as I said, I started from the Islamic architecture in general. I was very interesting about it and the Mediterranean world. So then I found the Turkish experience very interesting, not so known in Europe, even if very near. And from the work of Celâleddin, studying his works and his thoughts in these books, first of all, I found also the work of Turgut Cansever. So I knew Cansever through Eldem. It was this kind of process. And for this reason, I decided to start from the issue of transmission from a master to a student, because it was a very a topic that was very interesting to me. I think that it's important to clarify the meaning of transmission, because education is, for definition, transmission of values. But in the case of a school of architecture, the values are intrinsic to the object of transmission. So the design itself is always transmission of something and transposition of types, of places, of references. So I was first of all involved in this question. That is why I decided to start my thesis. That is not yet published, but I hope will be published in a few time. And
I hope as well, because it's in Italian, your thesis, yeah. And I don't know, I don't speak Italian, but
only a little part at the end.
Yeah, that's the part I read, and okay. You have a few papers in English, of course, that are very explanatory, of course, and I really read them with huge interest, because the main idea you mentioned, the transmissibility from the master to the student, that's very interesting, because I will mention, we mentioned this with you before, there is a very special method of education in traditional Turkish arts, especially music and in calligraphy and some other as well. And that's mainly an oral transmission from the master to the student. And this special method is called meşk in Turkish. And meşk technique, this method is the principal educational method for these traditional arts, which have a really serious root dating back to nearly 1,000 years, maybe. But we know that with the last 5 centuries of Ottoman Empire, there is a continuous line of transmission of knowledge in arts, which is focused on the special technique of meşk. All masters were teaching, educating their apprentices, their students, with this special technique. And it was not only transmitting the knowledge, but also the values of the master to the student. Mm-hmm. And it was inevitable to learn this art from a person, a living person, a master himself. It was not being able to transmit by a book, by a text. You have to find a living person, a living master, and you have to be committed to him or her, and so this knowledge of arts could be transmitted to you. And very interestingly, Cansever himself was actually both an architect, but also in his past he was a painter, and he was a musician. He was playing the ney, the reed flute, which is a very principal instrument of Turkish traditional music. And he had a master in this particular instrument, Halil Dikmen. He was also a professor of painting in the Academy of Fine Arts, but he was a very distinguished player of the ney. And Cansever was a student to him. And probably he had a relationship that was based on this meşk technique, an oral transmission from the master to the student. So this relationship is actually very inspiring and interesting for me when I read your paper about this transmissibility from the master to the student, and in this architectural school, as you mentioned, from Sedat Hakkı Eldem to Cansever.
Yeah, I think that is a more specific Islamic approach. And in the case of architecture, for example, is very important the question of construction. So architecture was conceived by Eldem and by Cansever as art of construction. So it's an art, and as art we have to practice that, to practice in the construction. The theory alone has not sense. This is a general question about architecture. I think architecture is made of theory and construction, but Cansever chose to be architect because he's attended the course, the yapı, so construction of Eldem, where he understood how to build. That's the question, the crucial point.
He also mentions a specific lesson in which Eldem describes the building method from the foundation to the roof and the finial at the end, and that's the moment when he decided to be an architect. Very interesting. Yeah,
and that's very interesting, and this is why I think that was important to focus on the element of transmission, because if we look at Eldem's and Cansever's architecture, we can find two distinct languages, two distinct ways of thinking architecture. But there were elements of transmission in the contents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the relevance of type, the importance of building process, architecture as art of construction, the idea that the design is new, but always starting from the awareness of the ancient. So it's not an invention at all. It came from the awareness of the heritage, of the constructing process, of the past in general. And from that, we can find an innovation. That's the general. So both for Cansever and for Eldem, I think that the modernity is already in the tradition and has to be recovered and rediscovered and reinterpreted.
Can we say, for example, Cansever and Eldem, they have two different languages actually, not in the same direction in all ways, but for both architects, the starting point is awareness. That's the first step, maybe. After awareness, they develop some other language of architecture, but awareness they share. And the relationship between modernity and tradition, I think they are both belonging to this time, but maybe it's like connecting the past and the future and the time, and like a time travel sometimes, and the results are of course different. And I want to actually ask you about this difference, because Cansever was a student of Eldem, and he even decided to be architect with one of his lectures. But the conclusion is very different. They have some other approach, some other style of saying, some other vision of architecture, some other vision of physical environment. Actually, what do you want to tell about this? And of course, let's connect this to your thesis. Of course, the main your main work area of work.
Yeah, first of all, I think that this difference in architecture, in the poetics of the two architects, demonstrate the still valid Eldem's method, because a master have to leave open possibilities, not to force. A real master have to transmit a method, but the method can give different results. And these results are different because people are different, and because times are different, and sites, and there are so many factors that influence the development of an architecture. But it is a school at all, because the school of Celâleddin and then of Cansever was focused on this theme that we mentioned before. So the types, my thesis started with a chapter, a first part, that I called Theory and Transmissibility of the Design. And the first chapter was called The City in Architects' Education. So the city is a material for educating, because it's a book, an open book, a collection of references, a set of layers of different time, and from that elements we can develop a new project, a new architecture. And the two transmission principles in Eldem I found were type and constructing process. And the second part of this, the second chapter, was called Recovering the Antique to Build the New. So Cansever and the interpretation of the city, because from all this material, architects developed his own interpretation. And interpretation means have a critical thought. So understand reality and have an opinion on the reality and give his proper contribution to the changement of reality. For this reason, I think that we can define a school of architecture, a Turkish school of architecture.
I'm sorry, I was muted. If we come to Beyazıt Square project in particular, I know this story that there were three different architects preparing proposals for the square. One of them was Piccinato, an Italian architect. The other was Hans Hög, a German architect. And the last one was Sedat Hakkı Eldem. So these three giant names, they were preparing a proposal for this very precious square of the historic Istanbul. And then I think this is also transmitted, an oral transmitted history of the project. None of them were being able to be actually elected, and Cansever was himself criticizing these projects. So he makes another proposal. He prepares his project and his vision for this square, and it is told that there was a conclusion on his project, and his proposal was chosen, and it was decided to be built. But as you mentioned, it was not very widely accepted even in his time. So this project has been discussed even in his time, and there was a lot of reactions, a lot of criticism when the project was being started to be executed on site. And it's really interesting that Beyazıt Square is still being discussed. And today, what we have there is not very satisfactory for this historical and beautiful city. So completing his project and restoring his project is also being discussed today. So what do you want to tell about this? Because this is your special area of interest, especially this project. So even in his time it was discussed. There were a lot of reactions from the old users of Istanbul and a lot of people. So today it's being still discussed. So there is like 50 years in between. What do you want to tell about this?
I think that there are different reasons, and we have to start understanding the site and the competition, and then perhaps we can understand better what Cansever made and why today is still discussed. So where I started studying Beyazıt Meydanı, I found that the strong debate was held during the 50s when Menderes decided to renovate the image of the city and to redesign the square. And the square was conceived at the beginning of the 16th century as a as an ensemble of distinct objects in a void, because according to the approach of the Sultan of the time, that was a mystic, a Sufi. So the system was put in an empty space without limit, and the only limit was the wall of the old palaces that contained a garden and opened it toward the sea, toward the landscape. That was the original situation of Beyazıt Meydanı. Then, after the destruction of the 19th centuries, the Meydan became a roundabout, and a new Orientalist style gate was built at the place of the ancient one, and that imposed an artificial axiality to the complex, so a different situation. And for this reason, for this complexity, for the complexity of the site and the history and the set of layers of that site, that was first the forum of Beyazıt, of the Byzantine city, then the Meydan of the Ottoman one. All the architects were very involved in this renovation and wanted to give contribution to the renovation. And the Eldem made some drafts, the first in 1925, then he worked again on that at the end of the 30s, but the solution was not so happy, because at a first glance we can be surprised, because the solution of Eldem was dividing the square into two parts through a large street, a boulevard. I understood that this solution was due to the previous plan that was accepted the year before, so Eldem must respect this situation. And the first project of Eldem was reduced to rebuild the walls around the madrasa and the mosque, and to insert a coffee house. After the project for Eldem's competition projects was different again, and was indeed a square in a European sense, and made with big terraces following a different different direction of the monuments, with fountains in the focus, in the center point, and that was the idea of Eldem for the competition. Then there was the Hans Hog proposal that consisted in the realization of an underground shopping mall with about 3,000 shops, and also the square level was lowered, and so the connection with the street and the old bazaar was ensured by a large ramp, and that was the solution proposed by Hogg. At the other hand, we have the solutions of Piccinato and Cansever that I found more linked, because at that time they worked together at the Istanbul Master Plan, strongly criticizing the solution of a Prost plan. And for this reason, I think that their two projects are a bit more sensitive and a bit more attentive to the landscape, to the site, to the history of the site. Indeed, they both worked with different ground level, and I think that Cansever project is interested in the way he used to work with the ground. So a ground design, at the end. And so Cansever's project was chosen, but with the clause of some changes made by the municipality. And the main supporter of Cansever project was exactly Piccinato. Instead, Eldem was disapproving the project, and this caused also the breakdown between master and scholar. So this breakdown was at that time, and from now on, it was never restored, completely restored. So this is the situation of the competition that I didn't analyze in depth all the project, but I tried to understand the general approach of the four architects. I think that Cansever project that started in 1961 indeed was never complete because it was strongly criticizing, and it was criticized because it was the first attempt of pedestrianization of a Turkish square, and the unique sample, I think, of construction of a modern Ottoman Meydan. So these two aspects was very innovative and very courageous too. And for this reason, not all the architects and the chambers and the municipality itself accepted all the solution of proposed by Cansever. So Cansever refers to the original Ottoman Meydan as an urban era without a specific function, a space closer to a notion of nature than urbanity. And I decided to focus, I don't think that Beyazıt Meydanı project is the best project of Cansever, but anyway, I think it's the more interesting because it clarifies the intent of Cansever, the approach and the conception that how the Ottoman city developed, not imposing itself on the Byzantine one, rather establishing new relationship between different and opposite elements of the city. In the same way, the contemporary city had to deal with its past. That's the Cansever approach. And what means? It means that we have to accept all the contradiction present, all the pre-existing elements, also the elements that are not approved by the architects, as for example the new Oriental style gate. It is part of the pre-existing situation, and an architect have to accept that and to go on, to go further and transmit an approach to future generation in which conservation and invention is not so significant, because the distinction between new and old is not so significant. The conflict arising from the complexity of the situation can be resolved thanks to their interpretation of the signs of the pre-existence. And this is a very Islamic approach, I think, because it is connected with the doctrine of unity, that in Cansever is a crucial focus point in his poetics. So unity in Islam not conceive the distinction between sacred and profane, And in the same way, architecture can be interpreted as something that have not distinction between modernity and tradition, regionalism, internationalism. So for Cansever, modernity is already inside, within the tradition, and we have only to rediscover new languages and new forms. And I want to say also that for Cansever, Islam is more than a religious doctrine to celebrate with architecture. Is rather a vision of the world in which we found a theory of the project that embraced the diversity. So the pre-existence, what we find, we have to embrace it to reinterpret and to accept in somehow. So this is the general approach, in my opinion, of Cansever architecture, and I think that Beyazıt Meydanı can be representative of this approach. And indeed,
very inspiring.
Very
inspiring points.
Yeah, I think that Cansever was very innovative in this sense. Yeah.
I have a few notes, if I'm not interrupting.
And so Cansever considers all the urban elements as present at the same time, because for Cansever, sites are bridges connecting past and future. So that is. And on one hand, he worked on the invention, as I said, of these new grounds, and establishing new relationships between these elements, and use this so-called form of transposed axiality that he found in Martinelli'nin, because it was introduced for the first time by Martinelli'nin, and consists of a divergence between the axes of the QE buildings. So the mosque is not in front of the madrasa, but is a bit transposed, a bit different. So the axes are transposed and a bit divergent. And he reconsidered the traces of the old palace, inserting a stairway, for example, that acts as a threshold in the place of the ancient gate, a ramp link the mosque level to the street and likes one of the ancient entrances to the prayers courtyard. The connection between all these parts of the system are possible thanks to small signs and reiterated elements that visitors could follow and have in order to have perception of the environment. So it's very a sensitive work. And all these operations are directed to ask what was present before this urban conflict. So this is the element of transmission to future generation for Cansever. The questions is not the result, it's the question. The project has the ability of the capacity of transmitting a question, a doubt, and this is useful to understand places and to give rise to new interpretation. On the other hand, he worked on the little buildings that are never realized, with a composition, an additive cumulative composition of elements. So all these punctual elements of the project that were the pavilion and the trees are are condensed around the main monuments, the mosque and the madrasa, because these two monuments are conceived as the two focus points, and around this point we can have a polar composition of elements. And this type of composition I found has figurative analogies with the Islamic art, with the abstract art, also the Western one, for example, Kandinsky. Mm-hmm. And so this demonstrates the great wiseness of Cansever, because he knew also the art, Islamic art and European art.
He refers to Kandinsky himself, right?
And what about the pavilion? The pavilion came from the type of Kusk. So he inserted a vernacular type and reinterpreted the vernacular type in a modern language. And he put these buildings on the different levels of the new grounds. And this is also an experimentation of juxtaposition between the little wooden buildings and the great monuments of stone. In this contrast, we can find another time an expression of Islamic approach, because if the intuitive knowledge belongs to God, man gets to know the world only by contrast. And this is a Sufi concept that he tried to put. But anyway, it's also the traditional construction of the Turkish city, because in the tradition, the houses were wooden houses, and the monuments were in stone. So it's very simple at the end, but the concept inside is more complex if we go to analyze in depth all the aspects. And to develop this interpretation of Cansever project that I study for my thesis, I used a lot of drawings, so interpretative drawings that I try to make starting from the drawings I found in the Cansever archive. And that's, I think, the only way and to understand, to really understand the project, because we don't have finished drawings of Cansever. A lot of materials are lost. So the work was a work of interpretation of drawings and reconstruction of drawings that gave rise to a more general overall of the Cansever project.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I have actually a few notes while you were talking. But it was a quite inspiring and you made very important points. One of them was you said that Cansever's Beyazıt project is not his best project maybe, but a very important project, maybe the most important project, because of his intent and his approach. And within this context, you mentioned, and we should mention maybe, the idea of Meydan, of course. The idea of Meydan, the square, is not originally coming from the Islamic heritage. It's something new for the Islamic city, maybe. And Cansever it tries to interpret this to put this in his own way of the Islamic legacy. And this was maybe the struggle point. This was the the resistance maybe he had to face, because Eldem was accepting the Prost plan and he was accepting the circumstances and he was proposing something new, maybe probably with a touch of identity, of course, like his architecture. But Cansever was, as I understand, he was criticizing the idea of the square, and he was interpreting it in a new approach. And also he was he puts some criticisms about the Great Gate and the direction of the mosque, and he understands, he's very aware of the past and what has been done there. But what he proposes is, I think, not changing it, but opening up the possibilities and proposing some change there. He is not directly changing or forcing something, but he instead tries to open up new possibilities and new directions, and like he's trying to free up the square. And also you mentioned the pavilions and the small buildings that he never was able to construct, to build there. They were probably the tension between the monument, the heavy and the permanent monument, and the light and small and temporary, let's say, buildings. This was very important, I think, and we had never had the chance to experience that, because today Istanbul has its monumental buildings preserved mostly, but we don't have the civil buildings that were creating the sense of scale and the tension between the monumental and the temporary, the civil one. We don't have that actually today. We have only the monuments, and we perceive the monuments as beautiful objects that are to be watched, to be seen in a pictorial way. Actually, I think Cansever was trying to create this tension again, but he was never able to do that. I think this approach is not something easy to achieve even today, because the general approach is to have huge voids and having the monuments in the middle of this void, like an object actually. That's very, very challenging, I think. And one point that is very inspiring for me was the relationship he's establishing with the history, with the past. I feel that he is not alienating himself from the past. He's traveling to, and he's easily connecting himself to the past, and he's not returning to the past, because what he does is something new, and he's saying something to the future. He's not repeating the past, for example. He's living with the past and the future at the same time, sometimes, maybe. And from this point, you pointed out the concept of unity, which I think seems to be something really unique about his approach to the architecture. And he's mentioning about religion and Islam is not something, is not only a religion to be celebrated with rituals and such, but instead a way of imagining, a way of thinking of the universe and the environment itself, the whole world. So it's a way of seeing the world. That's very, I think, unique. And this is the point that releases Cansever from the form, from style, from schools and such. So he's being connected to something else, and that is the concept, the idea that frees him, that enables him to to create his own language and not limited to styles or the material or the school that he is committed to. Very interesting point. This transposed axiality, as you said, which again is really interesting, because today when we are trying to design a square, for example, it's really hard to avoid those rational axialities and the rational geometry that comes within our reflex, but it's really inspiring to see that he is trying to even break that that cage, let's say, that cage of rationalism, and instead he is trying to open up new possibilities and open space for the individual that is going to experience the square himself. That's very interesting for me, to be able to get out of the box and to see those transposed axialities, the broken geometries. And I feel that is something very human. That is something very sensitive about human soul and human existence in this universe. That lets the person, that lets the individual to be himself, herself, and express his or her identity in his or her own way. That was very, very inspiring for me. And as again you mentioned, that is, this project is based on a pedestrian square with no vehicles, and just before this design, the square was a roundabout actually for cars. This was a serious change, which was criticized in that time. But today, this is a must for a city square. We in our imagination, in our acceptance. For his time, I think this approach was a very future-forward seeing approach, because cars were like they were very sacred instruments of urban design in that time, because they were something new, very innovative, very precious, very important things, very important vehicles. But he was able to reject cars in Beyazıt Square at that time, and I really find this very important. And if we come from that experience to today's Istanbul, now this project is still being discussed. And what I want to ask at this point is, time passes after design, and city changes, and everything, of course, develops, changes in some different ways. When we come to Istanbul in 2020, how do you approach with this completing Cansever project, building it again with its, at least the principal ideas, with the principal decisions? Isn't it something old? Do we have to update it, for example? Or can we say that this project is not limited to time, but it has some decisions that can also speak for this time and future as well? Because this is an actual decision now, discussion in Istanbul now. Beyazıt Meydan is in not a good condition right now, and something has to be done there. And as far as I'm concerned, the municipality, who is the main actor there, the municipality is in the intention of rebuilding this Cansever project. But this also brings its own discussions. Besides the the qualifications of the project itself, it also makes us have to discuss the relationship between time and design, because it's not an actual design. It's been designed several decades ago. So what do you think about building this project in contemporary context in Istanbul?
So first of all, we have, I think, to talk about, I want to start it from the beginning. So the difference between Eldem and Cansever and the elements of innovation in Cansever project, because Eldem on the subject of public space wrote in Turkey. Turkish towns did not have a square in the European sense. There is no doubt that the lack of the city squares in the European sense deprived the Turks of some of the most socially and aesthetically important aspects of civic life. So for Eldem, the position is clear.
Yeah.
I look at the European square as a reference to refers to, so as a something that's miss in the Turkish city, and that's why for Eldem's assessment is probably due to a fascination for European society that he experienced during his journey in Europe. But actually the Turkish city did not have a square because he had originally a public space, a different type of public space. We can say that the Meydan is connected to the mosque as the square, European square, is connected to the church in terms of representation of sacred spaces. But the formal and social features of these two spaces are not comparable, because on one hand, the European square embraces the essence of the public life that took scene on the parvis, around a symbolic building of devotion to God, to the community. And even if social rituals evolved in times, the different status of society are always showed in front of the church. On the other hand, the Turkish Meydan represents itself and is not in origin a place devoted to socialization, but as the mosque finds its space in the city, in the great tawhid of the city, people find their spaces and their places in the Meydan, according to rule of spontaneous appropriation. That was the Ottoman Meydan significant. Now the times are changing, and perhaps also the Cansever project has another significance today. But I think that Cansever's project was really forward-looking and very innovative for that time. And that's why the project was not accepted at the time. Because it was a sort of fascination for vehicles, and so modernity was connected with the use of the car and the vehicles. Today is different. Modernity is another thing. So is a more sustainable way of travel and traveling or moving in the city. But I think that public space is a crucial theme also today in Turkey, and it was demonstrated by the the Biennale of Venice in 2014. That was the first Biennale for the Turkish pavilion, and the issue was public space and square in Istanbul. So it's clear that perhaps the city wants have always still have to find his position in this sense. But I think that Cansever project is still valid because it leave open possibilities. For example, the buildings. The buildings are perhaps made with a bit postmodern language in style, and that can be changed, but the contents is still valid. So Cansever chose to use this sort of building or little pavilion that were disposed apparently without a rule.
Without a?
Apparently, without a rule.
Okay.
But the rule, there was a rule, and I demonstrate with the drawings. And these buildings hosted in the original project some shops and cafes and place for culture. I think that the use can change, but the architecture can still rest and remain and host the use that today are necessary. And the idea of pedestrian square is necessary, as I think that the Cansever project has not strongly defined spaces. And this is a point of force, because this means that today can be converted in what we need. It's the time that change the place and not the place that address the use. And so it's true that each year I came in Istanbul, I found Beyazıt Meydanı different, because the changing and the uses are so fast, and also is not recognized today as a square. Is like a park, perhaps, or a car park. But Cansever introduced the trees to avoid the car parking, for example, and or the pavilion, or the changing levels of the square. So I think that Cansever's ideas for Istanbul, even if not completely operative, still remain forward-looking, and were valid also because Beyazıt Meydanı was part of a system of squares, of spaces, of little towns that he identified in the city of Istanbul as a polar composition of places. And I think that this is very important. So understanding that Beyazıt Meydanı is not an alone standing object, but is part of the city, of the city structure, and that's why today Istanbul has lost a lot of heritage, the minor one. So the houses, the wooden houses, the most part is lost, and this is a pity, because they were important as well as the monuments. They were the city in the whole, in its unit, was important, was an element of transmission and of legacy, and not only the monuments. So I think that in this sense, Cansever project can be still innovating.
Very nice. Thank you. Probably you have seen Sevince Bayrak, her work. She prepared a dark little thesis about Beyazıt Square. Did you see that work? Of Sevince Bayrak. She's an architect as well.
No, I didn't. I don't know if I read something, because now I finished my PhD thesis in 2017.
This is probably later than you. This is
later.
Yeah, a late work. I would ask if you see that work, how would that change your, or does it change your approach to this project? It's about the history of the square. I will send you something about that work, and maybe we can have.
You can share.
Yeah, a new discussion about that. Eliana, thank you very much. I think it's a nice topic of discussion for me, but we are a little bit over our time. But it was a great talk for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we have a lot more to think and talk and write about these matters, and maybe to see some kind of future for Turkish architecture, because these are serious discussions, serious topics, and Turkish architecture needs these kind of topics on the table again. And these, I believe that these have the potential of opening new gates and new interpretations and new sayings in each coming year in the future, I hope. So thank you for that. Thank you for this nice discussion. If you have any final words or messages, we can record that as well.
Yeah, I want to thank you, all of you, and I would like also to thank here Cansever family that helped me a lot for developing this thesis, in particular Emino Cansever, and Paolo Girardelli, Attila Jucel, so the Salt Research Center. And I would like to invite students to better know the figure of Cansever and also that of Eldem, because from these architects we can always learn an approach and understand that architecture is not a matter of fashion, but is a matter of develop a critical ability and an interpretation, a matter of character. So that's very important for the future work of an architect.
Thank you. It was a nice message. Emine Öğün introduced me to your work as well. She and Mehmet Öğün and Emine Öğün, they are very important for me as well. And that was how I was introduced to your thesis. So thanks to her again from my side as well. Thank you very much, and thanks, and my thanks to Mimarhane as well for allowing us to have this discussion here. And I hope this will take place in all architectural students that are following Mimarhane, and it will be on their agenda to think on these figures, to explore them, and to put some new things on top of it, hopefully. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Have a good evening.